From the darkest reaches of space to the deepest corners of your mind. Welcome to From the Void.
Oceanside, California, 1962. Police receive a strange call from an unknown individual stating that he would soon be committing a baffling crime. April 10th, 1962. Ray Davis, a young cab driver for the Checker Cab Company, picks up a fare at a downtown cab stand and notifies his dispatcher that he will be delivering the fare to a location in South Oceanside. Ray is never heard from again. Now, nearly 60 years later, the murder of Ray Davis has yet to be solved. And in fact, Ray Davis had nearly been forgotten about completely until details of his murder resurface thanks to a local historian. The devil is in the details, as they say, and in this case, the devil might just be one of the most infamous serial killers in history. The details in the murder of Ray Davis seem awfully familiar to a series of other unsolved murders just north of Oceanside. Murders committed by the Zodiac Killer. This week I talk with Oceanside historian Kristi Hawthorne, who, while researching the Ray Davis case, thinks he may have been an early victim of the Zodiac Killer. So welcome to this week's episode, The Zodiac Killer and the Unsolved Murder of Ray Davis. Welcome to From the Void. All right, welcome to the podcast, Kristi Hawthorne. Thank you so much for spending some time with me tonight.
Thank you so much for having me. I feel very honored that you selected to speak with me.
Well, you've got a really cool, and we'll get to this, within the episode. You've got a very cool theory that adds to what is probably the most infamous, unsolved serial killer in modern history. So obviously, you can look at Jack the Ripper, but that's pretty far removed at this point, 1800s. But the Zodiac is more in modern memory, and so it's even more fascinating that this has gone unsolved for decades and decades and decades. So before we get into that, though, tell people a little bit about your background and what you do.
Well, actually, I am just a local here in Oceanside, California, which is in North San Diego County. I have been volunteering as the president of the Oceanside Historical Society for over 30 some years. And it's not a glamorous job. It's just something fun. And so I have always loved history, and particularly local history. And so I wasn't looking to solve any crimes, although I am a crime buff fan and I love all that stuff. And I have been even since when I was a child. Started off reading Nancy Drew and then Agatha Christie. And then I just jumped into, nonfiction. I just love the true crime stories rather than the fiction stories. So I wrote a book on the history of Oceanside. I'm currently working on a second book. I'm known as the historian for Oceanside because I've been doing this for so long. I write a blog and I write regularly for the Osider magazine and for other entities in and around San Diego. So that's the background. I have no formal training, by the way, in history. It's just something that I love, and I'm very knowledgeable about the history of the area just because I've been doing it for so long.
Love that. So let's talk about, because we have to kind of set the stage before we get into this unsolved crime that took place in Oceanside. So obviously we're here talking about the Zodiac Killer. So when did those murders start to take place? Like what part of the country did this take place, and what time frame are we talking about here?
Yeah, most of the the Zodiac killing started in I believe it was 72 up in Northern California, in the Vallejo area, the San Francisco area, and at 69 actually I think was the first one, if I'm not mistaken. Happened over a series of times. The Zodiac Killer, he really wanted recognition, as many serial killers do. So he started off by calling the police after one of his murders, called on the phone and let them know there was a body. Later on, of course, most people recognize him and would know him by his ciphers, because he sent coded messages to the police, kind of taunting them, if you will. But actually, his first communications to the police was by phone calls. And then he sent letters to the news stations up in San Francisco. And, and again, as you said, he's one of the most notorious unsolved, killers. We haven't identified him. And so it fascinates people, not just in the United States, fascinates people all over the world. And people have contacted me, and I'm not a Zodiac Killer expert by any stretch of the imagination, but people all over the world contact me and they tell me they know who he is. Would you please listen to my theory? And so it really captivates so many people around the world.
Yeah, and I think, as you said, one of the things that is so captivating and so unique in terms of serial killers anywhere in the world is the fact that he was this type of individual who would taunt the police, and he sent these strange kind of cryptic letters and things to the press, and some of which I think there's correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe there's 4 ciphers in total that he sent, and only 2 of them, and one of those 2 very recently was just solved, and the other 2 remain a mystery. We still don't know what they say.
Right. And it's pretty remarkable that this cipher just got, I believe, as you mentioned, solved this year. And it's been sitting in the hands and people have been trying to crack that cipher for decades, and kind of exciting that someone, actually did that. So people are really dedicated to this case. There's so many people with so many different theories. But aside from the police department, there's so many, armchair sleuths and legitimate detectives looking to see if they can solve this.
Yeah, and one of the other interesting things that I think has also caused complications over the years is the fact that there were some potential witnesses over the course of these killings, and the physical descriptions that they give seem to not necessarily, coincide with one another. They're a little, they don't necessarily agree. So is that, so in your research, what were some of the clues maybe that you started to find that maybe kind of tipped you off and made you think that maybe perhaps this was also one of his victims?
Well, so I wasn't researching the Zodiac, although personally I've watched, movies and television shows and read books and articles about the Zodiac. So, because again, I'm like one of those armchair, crime buffs. I love to watch all those shows and get caught up in it. But I was actually researching a completely different subject. It had nothing to do with murder. And I was researching St. Malo, which is an exclusive community, a gated community here in Oceanside. Was built in the very early 1930s by a very wealthy man from Pasadena. And so I was doing a search through newspaper articles for that particular enclave, if you will. And I happened across, I hit St. Malo and I hit murder. And at first I thought like, oh, cool. Someone in this ritzy neighborhood, some of these rich people, maybe they've got a skeleton in the closet and they've murdered someone. I want to write about that in my local blog, if you will. And I was a little disappointed to find out that it was, wasn't a St. Malo resident. It was a cab driver. But I still started going through the newspapers trying to find out, well, who killed him? And newspaper article after newspaper article. And then finally I hit on one where the Oceanside Police Department said that someone had called them and said that they were going to commit, a crime that they wouldn't be able to solve. And I thought, oh, that's weird. And then the next day, this cab driver's murdered. Well, then like 3 to 4 days later, then the Oceanside Police Department comes out and says, okay, the same caller, we believe the same caller, because he took responsibility and said, hey, remember me? I was the one who made that phone call. Well, now I'm going to go after a bus driver. And right then, I got so excited because I know, and although I'm not an expert, I know enough about the Zodiac that after he killed Paul Stein up in San Francisco, a cab driver, then he started making threats toward school buses, particularly school children. But I still saw the similarities. I'm going, oh my gosh, cab driver. I killed a cab driver. Now I'm going to go after a bus. And I got very, very excited. However, I still wanted to make sure that this case hadn't been solved, and I'm just barking up the wrong tree. So, that is when I researched for almost a year and a half before I called the Oceanside Police Department. And I wanted to verify that this case had not been solved. And I actually was able to talk to a cold case detective, said that this case had never been solved. And I said, oh, I need to meet with you. And at first I thought that when I brought him all my research, and I gave him my theory, I thought that he was going to laugh at me and like pat my head and go, okay, sure. But no, he took it seriously, and they reopened the case. In fact, the case was so old, even though it was unsolved, they had to pull it out of their records, pull it out of their files.
Wow.
And so I just started, deciding, okay, I'm going to put my research, I'm going to start researching this a little bit more thoroughly and putting my facts together, my timeline together, pulling a coroner's report and all of this other information. And that's kind of the genesis of this case. I wasn't looking for the Zodiac, wasn't looking for something like this. It kind of fell in my lap.
That's amazing, and the fact that you notice those distinct commonalities between the Zodiac killings and this unsolved homicide. So lay it out for folks. Like, when did this particular murder take place? Who was this individual? Who was this cab driver? He was a young guy, right?
Yeah. So Ray Davis was a relatively young man who came from Michigan with his brother, and they were very, very recent transplants in Oceanside. I believe that he had just come to Oceanside in January of 1962, and he was murdered in April. He was a cab driver. I believe his stepfather in Michigan was also a cab driver, and so maybe it was just something that he was familiar with. His brother was working at Camp Pendleton, which Oceanside has to the north of us, Marine Corps Base Camp Pendleton. And Ray Davis was married and had 2 stepchildren. He had no children of his own, but Ray and his wife were estranged. They were either legally separated or divorced. I'm not so sure, but she was living up in Pomona in the Los Angeles area. And so Ray Davis was downtown Oceanside waiting for a fare. He called his dispatch and said that, probably radioed it, of course not called, but radioed his dispatch and said that he had a fare that he was going to South Oceanside. And that is the area that St. Malo is in. It's the southernmost border of Oceanside along the coast. And his dispatcher never heard back from him. And he was found in the early morning hours. His body had been just abandoned in an alleyway, if you will, in the St. Malo area. And his cab then had been driven back to closer to the downtown area. It was still in the beach area, but it was, I think, some two miles north of where Ray Davis had been left.
Interesting. So the killer presumably takes off in the cab and dumps the cab off somewhere else as well.
Absolutely.
So What sort of was there any physical evidence that the police were able to uncover, like fingerprints or any kind of, obviously this is way before DNA testing and things like that, but
Right. One of the theories that the police had put out there was that this was a robbery initially, and a lot of newspaper articles went out throughout California and even in other states that this was a robbery. However, Ray Davis had some money tucked in his shirt pocket, as well as his wallet was on the front seat. And he had some papers and even a book on his front seat, and they said those were undisturbed. So his wallet still had money, his pocket had money, and so robbery was not a motive. I really do think that whoever had called the police, maybe they didn't plan to kill Ray Davis 24 hours before that, but they targeted him at some time that this would be easy. Oceanside's a very quiet town. At that time, we were small. St. Malo, again, is an exclusive area. It's right next to the train tracks. My theory is that maybe he waited to shoot Ray Davis, maybe when the train went by, and so residents wouldn't have been able to hear that. I have no idea. So, what was the motive and what were the evidence left? There were, they had slugs they removed from his body. Those are unusable. The fingerprints, they fingerprinted the car. And the other thing that they have is probably DNA evidence, which would be fascinating. Cold case detective Sylvia O'Brien told me that they have Ray Davis's clothes, and his belt loop was torn. So the killer would have gotten out of the back seat. And I guess I really haven't explained how Ray was shot. So if I could step back a little bit. The passenger would have been seated behind Ray Davis, who was driving his cab. There was a bullet through the windshield. There was a bullet hole through the windshield. There was a bullet through the back of the taxi cab seat that went into Ray Davis. And then he was shot in his head from behind, or perhaps maybe even slightly, to his, the side of his head, but the back side of his head. And so the killer would have exited then the car, opened up the car door, pulled Ray by his, perhaps maybe his shirt and of course his belt loop, which then was torn, and just unceremoniously left Ray. Now you can imagine there was, we've got a windshield, not completely broken, but cracked with a bullet hole. There had to have been some blood, even if it was a clean shot through the back, so to speak, that head wound, and the killer would have gotten in that cab and driven it away. It was in the very early morning hours. He left the cab in the 400 block in the alley behind South Pacific Street. And who knows what would happen. The transit, the bus station, the train station is very, very close there. So if he wasn't from Oceanside, he could have gotten on a train that could have taken him, anywhere, down to San Diego, up to Los Angeles, or he just could have, melded into the downtown some at some point in time. But OPD, the Oceanside Police Department, has said that that the clothing of Ray Davis has not been maintained in a pristine condition. There was not DNA back in 1962. They weren't concerned. They just knew that, hey, this has blood on it. This was the dead man's clothes. So they didn't take care of it the way they do now. So she's worried about maybe cross-contamination with other people. So if somebody else was holding it up without gloves, and now we've got, 15 people touching those clothes, what's it going to benefit? Now I've been told that the slugs were not of any use. Now the fingerprints. So I was told, yes, there's fingerprints and very excited about that. And I was just going, oh my gosh. And of course, again, me just like, watching CSI or something, just run those through APHIS, and
Right.
right. And then we'll know in like 45 minutes at the end of this show. But first of all, they had to, I guess, be determined as viable prints. And then when they went to send them in finally, because they did sit on them even after I contacted them. They have other things going on at the Oceanside Police Department.
Right.
But by the time they sent them in, COVID hit. And then Sylvia had told me that, hey, a lot of these labs are short-staffed. They're only working on emergency, cases, viable cases. And so we waited and waited and waited. And she contacted me just a few weeks ago by email and said that she had 2 hits on these fingerprints. There were so many fingerprints in this cab. It wasn't driven just by Ray Davis. It wasn't his personal cab. There was other drivers. There was passengers. I mean, think about how many times his cab would have gotten touched and fingerprinted. Well, so she said there was 2 sets of fingerprints that came back, but she wasn't going to share them with me.
Oh,
and,
interesting.
Yeah. I know. So I did thank her for calling me and reaching out to me and letting me know that there were 2 matches that they were going to look into. The other thing that of note, it's kind of frustrating too when you think about the age of this case, just being so old, pre-DNA, and of course these fingerprints and all of this eyewitness maybe testimony, and the detectives are gone, is the fact that apparently the police departments up in Northern California do not want to really participate and share information, not even with other police departments. And Sylvia, the detective, expressed, a little bit of, frustration with that they have a case that they would like to pursue. She said that other policemen in the department thinks that there is a very good chance that there is a relationship to the Zodiac Killer, but they're not getting any cooperation with the departments up in the San Francisco and Vallejo area.
Wow, that's amazingly disappointing, because I know that was an issue at the time, not in just this case, but a lot of cases where if a killer committed murders, in different areas that fell under different jurisdictions, one of the issues was that, there was no collaboration. And so, it took way longer than it should have to potentially catch this person because of the fact that they wouldn't, whether it's hubris or pride or whatever, getting in the way. It's amazing to think that's still happening in 2021.
It's still happening. And, you can attribute that to all sorts of things, because this case is so fascinating to so many people. They're probably inundated with phone calls and emails and everyone. Like I said, I just wrote a blog about it, and I have gotten emails and contacts from people across the world, from Italy and Russia and Ireland and across the country, of me just writing a blog about Ray Davis' murder and people wanting to say, I know who did it. And so if you can imagine how much more a police department would get those. So I think probably they're playing it very close to the vest. I do think that they probably have invested decades of time, and so they don't want to share their information. But it is frustrating that they wouldn't at least communicate with another police department who perchance have a very similar case on their hands. And I think one of the fascinating things to me too is that in 1962, when Ray Davis was murdered, and then I think it was in 69 when Paul Stein, the cab driver, was shot and killed. Now I know we don't have the internet back then, and news traveled, but you would think that maybe the Oceanside detectives in Oceanside would have said, like, because it was front page news. It was on the news, like, wow, hey, we had a cab driver get shot in Oceanside, and we had to put armed guards on our buses because this guy threatened to blow up a bus or whatever it was. And so I don't know. I don't know why somebody just didn't pick up a phone, or did they? I don't know, because all those detectives sadly have passed.
Yeah, and to your point, like you said earlier, they may have reached out, but at that point, they're at a fever pitch in terms of the panic that these murders were having, this effect that it was having on society, specifically in that Lake Vallejo, San Francisco area, that it may have just gotten buried, unfortunately, with all the other tips and leads and things coming in at the time, which is unfortunate. One of the things that I was thinking about when I was reading your blog post about it is that, this is obviously a much earlier murder that took place. And, when we think about, like, we know so much more about serial killers now and kind of the thought process and the psychology. And so often we find out that the serial killers, they kind of escalate and earlier on when they're kind of trying to figure out their MO and their style or their approach or whatever, can potentially make mistakes. And so we have a situation here that if it is indeed connected, there's a potential that the killer made a mistake and the evidence could be sitting there that could have this domino effect and solve all of these other unsolved murders. Exactly.
One of the things too that this case fascinated me so much with Ray Davis is that, again, sadly to say, in America, even in the 60s, people get shot and killed, if not every day, quite often. It's just the way that it is. But what made this case stand out was that the Oceanside Police Department, because of this phone call that forewarning them or taunting them about this thing that was going to happen that they were not going to be able to solve, and then the killer making good on it, and then calling them back and making yet another threat. Well, at that point in time, the Oceanside Police Department thought that this was such a viable threat that they had to make an announcement, and they published it in the newspaper. They put armed guards on the buses, and that, when they did that, that made news all across the country. So even though the Ray Davis murder had made some local newspapers in Orange County, Los Angeles, and San Diego, when the Oceanside Police Department published the fact that now they were going to have to guard buses because they were taking this man's threat very, very seriously, that's kind of when, it went all over the place, from the East Coast up to, Washington and Oregon and the Midwest and everywhere. The people were very terrified. Again, we've got a sleepy little beach town, and nothing like that had ever happened. And I don't think anything like that actually happened in America, in the United States, that they had to put armed guards on a bus because they were fearing that a murderer was loose. And so the fact that this would have faded into obscurity so soon, in not only just Oceanside, but in the consciousness of people here in California, is kind of fascinating to me. But they took it very seriously. And so even if, let's say, if this is a Zodiac, or it's just another random person, and it's not the Zodiac, who calls the police to say, hey, I'm going to do this thing and you're never going to solve it. It's going to baffle you, or whatever the words he said. And then who bothers to call back? Who follows through? Who calls back? Who makes another taunt? If this was his first rodeo, I guarantee you this guy went on to do it again, because he got such a response. That of course, he didn't stay in Oceanside because nothing happened to the buses, and we didn't have another murder in this manner. But I think he probably traveled. So is this guy sitting somewhere? Did he die in prison because he was an actual serial killer and we just haven't hooked him up to anybody else? Or was this pattern so distinct that he is in fact the Zodiac?
It does. I mean, there is a compelling case for the fact that maybe if this was his first murder, that this was kind of his trial run, this small unsuspecting town. and he kind of tries this thing out, and in fact did get away with it. Whether it was a Zodiac or not, as you said, whoever it was, phoning in these taunts, these threats, made good on it, and he was right. You're not going to solve it, and we haven't, at least up till this point.
I know.
So were you able to look at the Paul Stein case more closely and try to see if there were some other similarities? Like, I know you said the slugs were kind of not real useful, but could you determine if it was the same caliber weapon or, that sort of thing?
So I think in the Paul Stein case that he was shot with a different weapon, but, the Zodiac used different weapons. And one of the weapons he did use was, excuse me if I get this wrong, but I think it's a long rifle with a .22. And so he used different weapons, and why he would have switched things up. I think he always liked to keep the police guessing. So in his early murders, I believe he used this long rifle. I think he killed Paul Stein with a .44. All of you who happen to be listening, don't yell at me if I'm getting the Paul Stein facts wrong. But he was very, very bold in killing this taxi driver up in San Francisco. He took. He cut off a piece of this shirt of the cab driver. He wanted to prove to the police it was me. Again, he wants to be noticed. He's writing these ciphers. He's calling in. He's sending these clues. He's sending these, articles to substantiate the fact that he is the one murdering these people, and the fact that. That people saw him. And of course, the Paul Stein case, it was just tragic because, he was described as a white man. And then I think it later gets told by the dispatcher, but the police are looking for a black man. And he walks right past the police who are on their way to the scene. And what an opportunity, which is lost tragically. And will we ever know? Because there's so many people with so many theories. It's a very, very frustrating thing. Now, one of the theories is, of course, that perhaps, makes Ray Davis's murder more viable, if you will, would be some people assert that the boots that he was wearing in one case, were military style boots. Was he from Camp Pendleton? Was he from one of the naval stations down here in San Diego? And some people bristle at the fact that somebody would say, well, he was military because there's the vast majority of people who are serving the military are honorable people who want to serve their country. But certainly Camp Pendleton right next door. And he could have disappeared, onto that base. And maybe he was getting out of the military, maybe he was getting out of the Marines, maybe he was getting out of the Navy, and he was just going to leave his mark. And of course, one of the theories then is that there was another early Zodiac murder with Sherry Jo Bates up in Riverside. I believe that was in 68, maybe 66. I'm sorry, I just don't have my timeline in front of me. I should know that. And so that would kind of make sense. Perhaps maybe he started in San Diego, went up to Riverside, and then meandered, up north.
Yeah, and as you said, for someone who, adoration or at least, attention seemed to be part of the thrill. As you said, starting out in a smaller location like Oceanside, what's going to be even more thrilling after that? Well, obviously, bigger city, bigger newspapers, more attention, more eyes on it. It sort of makes sense as he's kind of ramping up or escalating in the killings. So did you look into any of the particular popular suspects to see if any of them may have been in kind of the area at the time, or?
I have not been able to. I picked a handful of people, and I looked to see if I could find any ties to Oceanside or San Diego County, and I haven't found anything definitive to say that, oh my gosh, yes, here, all of those suspects, it could be somebody else. I mean, we just don't know. I mean, I know people have their favorites, and I don't even know their names right now. I know one is Geik, and there's, or nicknamed, but there's so many different people, and then many of them passed away. And, certainly if he's still alive, he's a very old man. But what piques everyone's curiosity and even hope, though, is that Golden State Killer was caught. And he's a very old man, still alive, and he was just living incognito for all of these years. And they were finally able to solve that. But it's the DNA, I think, has not gone anywhere with what San Francisco and Vallejo has. There's a possibility, OPD suggested, because there's some type of DNA collection process that they use. I want to say with it it's like a vacuum, but I don't know. It's something like that where they can actually collect that DNA. Mm-hmm. But of course, all of that stuff costs money. And do they have, the funds for that? Can they get approval? This case is, again, I mean, it's as old as me. And, is that possible to, even, consider doing, and the cost of it? What would it produce? Are we spinning our wheels? But me, of course, leave no stone unturned. Let's do it. But
right.
I'm not the one making the decisions.
Well, then the other hope too, obviously, is that as time passes, technology improves and it gets it becomes more affordable and that sort of thing. So you kind of wonder if there's technology right around the corner that might be accessible and affordable. That might be the thing that breaks the case. But super interesting. Any other thoughts that you have just in the research that you've done? Any other things that were kind of surprising or in your opinion, really kind of link this murder to potentially the Zodiac?
Yeah, I think just the circumstances. One of the other things that the Zodiac up in the San Francisco area claimed that there was more people, claimed that there was people down south, was that as far south as San Diego County, Riverside County. I think maybe the chances are he was embellishing his story because he really, really, really wanted to, taunt the police. And he really, really wanted to strike fear in the hearts of as many people. So, if that was true, though, if he said, there's others down south, it could lend itself. And I do think, though, I mean, how many active serial killers in the 1960s? It was a heyday for active serial killers in California, unfortunately. but how many then were calling and taunting the police? There was the Hillside Strangler and whatnot. I don't necessarily know if they were taunting the police. They were just killing as many people as they could to get away with it. But the Zodiac in particular, I think part of his MO and one of his satisfactions was that communication with the police department, not unlike the BTK killer in Wichita, Kansas. He was killing people and he wanted to be noticed. And, he wrote, what do I have to do to get my name in the paper? He demanded it. And so I really do think that, whether it's linked or not, that Ray Davis's murderer wanted to communicate with the police. He wanted the notoriety. He wanted the fame. And here we have someone up in Vallejo and San Francisco wanting to communicate with with the police departments up there and wanting to be recognized. And I think going through elaborate ciphers and whatnot, I think he just loved the cat and mouse game. And so there is the link there. Whether it's true or not, I think, or whether it proves to be the same person, I do still think that Ray Davis's murder needs to be solved. There's no one left to mourn or lament the passing of Ray Davis. And he's just sadly is completely forgotten in all of this. But, he his murder still deserves to be solved, whether it's linked to the Zodiac or not. And so I think about that a lot of times. I just think, where is the justice for Ray? Where was the justice for his mother, who never knew what happened to her son, for his brother? It just never came to fruition, sadly.
Yeah, I think that is kind of the missed part of the story. It's, we, as a collective public or whatever, we have this fascination with serial killers just because they're so contrary to, to the world around us and the everyday kind of motions of life. But we forget about these victims, and a lot of these victims were very, very young, whose lives were ahead of them. And, and these crimes have not been solved, and there has been no justice in terms of, bringing this killer, forward to answer for these murders.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much for coming on. Tell people where they can stay on top of what you're up to and kind of follow along with the progress of this case.
Yeah, so I write a blog. It's called historiesandmysteries.blog. And I started off doing this just kind of fun. As a historian, I write about all the wonderful, nice history in Oceanside. But I've been doing this for so long, I kind of have some, not for primetime history, not for the kiddies kind of thing. Nothing terrible, but maybe you wouldn't want to read in a coffee table book about, your city. And so I just kind of started compiling little tidbits of odd stories. And when I started researching Ray, I really thought I had to put a story together. And really, once I posted my blog, and after I got all my research, and I contacted the Oceanside Police Department, and I put this on my blog and kind of posted it and sent it out there, it was amazing, how many people picked it up. The local news channels, and I tell you, it was fascinating. CBS here down in San Diego, they actually found the old news footage of this murder. So you can see the cab, you can see the area where Ray Davis was left, you can see exactly what it looked like. And I was going on no photos. In fact, that's one of the things that when I had talked to the cold case detective, I was asking them for any crime scene photos they could share with me. Oh, we can't share. I go, I'm not looking for anything gory, just a shot of this cab, just a shot. Nope, we can't share anything with you. And then when News 8 sent me the footage of their news story, and back in 1962, I just almost died. So it's kind of just snowballed there because people are fascinated with it, and as I said before I let you go, whether this is tied to the Zodiac Killer, it would be so fascinating and so exciting that it would be, and that could ever be proven. But however, I do hope that maybe one of these days, will somebody confess on their deathbed? Will somebody call and say, my dad, my uncle, I don't know, my boyfriend or my ex-husband, told me this story a long time ago? Sometimes that happens a lot too. But I really do hope that the murder of Ray Davis will be solved.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for coming on. This is absolutely fascinating. And, there are a lot of crazy similarities there. So I hope that at some point we do move this case along. And like you said, whether it's connected or not, hopefully this is a case that doesn't stay cold and that there is some justice here in the end.
Thank you so much. And thank you again for reaching out to me and including me on your podcast. I so appreciate that. It's very exciting.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Was Ray Davis the first, or at least an earlier, victim of the Zodiac? Or was he just an unfortunate victim at the hands of a killer who seemingly had no motive? Either way, the family of Ray Davis deserve an answer. And hopefully, through the work of people like Kristi Hawthorne, they get one soon. I'll be back next week with a brand new mystery. And as always, thank you for listening to From the Void.